Right, you guys are starting on page 88. You don't have a genre-based thinking job today, so you're just focused on annotations, and then you're going to have some multiple choice questions to answer on your form at the end. As we neared the house, Mr. Granger's Packard rolled from the dusty driveway. Mr. Morrison directed Jack to the side of the road until the big car had passed, then swung the wagon back into the road center and up the drive. Big Ma was standing by the yard gate that led onto the drive, gazing across the road at the forest. Big Ma, what was Mr. Granger doing here? Stacy asked, jumping from wagon and going to her. Little man Christopher John and I hopped down and followed him. Nothing, Big Ma replied absently, her eyes still on the forest. Just worrying about me and this land again. Oh, said Stacy, his tone indicating that he considered the visit of no importance. Mr. Granger had always wanted the land. He turned and went to help Mr. Morrison. Little man and Christopher John went with him, but I remained by the gate with Big Ma. Big Ma, I said, what Mr. Granger need more land for? Don't need it, Big Ma said flatly. Got more land now than you know what to do with. Well, what do you want with ours then? Just like to have it, that's all. Well, seems to me he's just being greedy. You ain't gonna sell it to him, are you? Big Ma did not answer me. Instead, she pushed open the gate and walked down the drive and across the road into the forest. I ran after her. We walked in silence down the narrow cow path, which wound through the old forest to the pond. As we neared the pond, the forest gapped open into wide brown glade, man-made by the felling of many trees, some of them still on the ground. They had been cut during the summer after Mr. Anderson came from Strawberry with an offer to buy the trees. The offer was backed with a threat, and Big Ma was afraid. So Anderson's lumbermen came, chopping and sawing, destroying the fine old trees. Papa was away on the railroad then, but Mama sent Stacy for him. He returned and stopped the cutting, but not before many of the trees had already fallen. Big Ma surveyed the clearing without a word. Then, stepping around the rotting trees, she made her way to the pond and sat down on one of them. I sat close beside her and waited for her to speak. After a while, she shook her head and said, I'm sure glad that Grandpa never had to see none of this. He dearly loved these here old trees. Him and me, we used to come down here early mornings, or just 'fore the sun was about to set, and just sit and talk. He used to call this place his thinking spot, and he called that old pond there Caroline, after me. She smiled vaguely, but not at me. You know, I wasn't hardly 18 when Paul Edward married me and brung me here. He was older than me by about 8 years, and he was smart. Oh, ow, my lord, that was one smart man. He had himself a mind like a steel trap. Anything he seen done, he could do it. He had done learned carpentry back up there near Macon, Georgia, where he was born. Born into slavery he was, 2 years 'fore freedom came. And him and his mama stayed on at that plantation after the fighting was finished. But then when he got to be 14 and his mama died, he left that place and worked his way across here up to Vicksburg. That's where he met you, ain't it, Big Ma? I asked, already knowing the answer. Big Ma nodded, smiling. Sure was. He was carpenterin' up there, and my papa took me in with him to Vicksburg. We was tenant farming about 30 miles from there, to see about getting a store-bought rocker for my mama. And there was old Paul Edward working in that furniture shop just as big. Had himself a good job, but that old job wasn't what he wanted. He wanted himself some land. Kept on talking about land, and then this place come up for sale. And he bought himself 200 acres from that Yankee, didn't he? Big Ma chuckled. That man went right on over to see Mr. Hollenbeck and said, Mr. Hollenbeck, I understand you got land to sell, and I'd be interested in buying me about 200 acres if your price is right. Old Mr. Hollenbeck questioned him good about where he was going to get the money to pay him, but Paul Edward just said, Don't seem to me it's your worry about how I'm going to get the money just as long as you get your paid price. Get paid your price. Didn't nothing scare that man, she beamed proudly. And Mr. Hollenbeck went on and let him have it. Of course, now he was just about as eager to sell this land as Paul Edward was to buy. He'd had it going on 20 years. Bought it during Reconstruction from the Grangers. 'Cause they didn't have no money to pay their taxes. Not only didn't have tax money, didn't have no money at all. That war left them plumb broke. Their old Confederate money wasn't worth nothing, and both Northern and Southern soldiers had done ransacked their place. Them Grangers didn't have nothing but they land left, and they had to sell 2,000 acres of it to get more money to pay taxes and rebuild the rest of it. And that Yankee bought the whole 2,000. Then he turned around and sell it back to him, huh, Big Ma? Sure did. But not till 87 when your grandpa bought himself that 200 acres. As I hear it, that Yankee offered to sell all 2,000 acres back to Harlan Granger's daddy for less than the land was worth. But that old Fillmore Granger was just about as tight as a penny as anybody ever lived, and he wouldn't buy it back. So Mr. Hollenbeck just let other folks know he was selling, and it didn't take long before he sold all of it, because it was some mighty fine land. Beside your grandpa, a bunch of other small farmers bought about 800 acres, and Mr. Jameson bought the rest. But that wasn't our Mr. Jameson, I supplied knowingly. That was his daddy. Charles Jameson was his name, Big Ma said. A fine old gentleman, too. He was a good neighbor, and he always treated us fair, just like his son. The Jamesons was what folks call Old South from up in Vicksburg, and I understands it. Before the war, they had as much money as anybody, and even after the war, they managed better than some other folks, because they had made themselves some northern money. Anyway, old Mr. Jameson got it into his mind that he wanted to farm, and he moved his family from Vicksburg down in here. Mr. Wade Jameson wasn't about but 8 years old then. But he didn't like to farm, I said. Oh, he liked it all right, just wasn't ever much hand at it, though, and after he went up north to law school and all, he just felt he ought to practice his law. Is that how come he sold Grandpa them other 200 acres? Sure is. And it was mighty good of him to do it, too. My Pole Edward had been eyeing that 200 acres ever since 1910 when he done paid off the bank for them first 200. But old Mr. Jameson didn't want to sell. About that same time Harlan Granger come head of the Granger plantation, you know. Him and Wade Jameson about the same year as children, and he wanted to buy back every inch of land that used to belong to the Grangers. That man crazy about anything that was before the war, and he wanted his land to be every bit like it was then. Already had more than 4,000 acres, but he just itching to have back them other 2,000 his granddaddy sold. Got back 800 of them, too, from them other farmers that bought from Mr. Hollenbeck. But Grandpa and old Mr. Jameson wasn't interested in selling, period, was they, Big Ma? They didn't care how much money Mr. Granger offered them, I declared with an emphatic nod. That's the truth of it, all right, agreed Big Ma. But when Mr. Jameson died in 1918, and Wade come ahead of his family, he sold them 200 acres to Paul Edward and the rest of his land to Harlan Granger, and moved his family into Strawberry. He could have just as easy sold the full 2,000 to the Grangers and got more money, but he didn't. Until this day, Harlan Granger still hold it against him because he didn't. The soft swish of falling leaves made Big Ma look up from the pond and at the trees again. Her lips curved into a tender smile as she looked around thoughtfully. You know, she said, I can still see my Paul Edward's face the day Mr. Jameson sold him them 200 acres. He put his arms round me and looked out at his new piece of land. Then he said exactly the same thing he said when he grabbed himself that first 200 acres. Said, Pretty Caroline, how would you like to work this fine piece of earth with me? Sure did. Said the same exact thing. She grew quiet then and rubbed the wrinkles down one hand as if to smooth them away. I gazed at the pond, glassy gray and calm, until she was ready to go on. I learned that at times like these it was better to just sit and wait than to go asking disrupting questions which might vex her. So long ago now, she said eventually, in a voice that was almost a whisper. We worked real hard getting them crops sown, getting them reaped. We had us a time, but there was good times too. We was young and strong when we started out, and we liked to work. Neither one of us, I'm proud to say, never was lazy. And we didn't raise us no lazy children neither. Had ourselves 6 fine children. Lost our girls when they was babies, though. I suppose that's one of the reasons I love your sweet mama so much. But them boys grew strong, and all of them loved this place as much as Paul Edward and me. They go away, they always come back to it. Couldn't leave it. She shook her head and sighed. Then Mitchell, he got killed in the war, and Kevin got drowned. Her voice faded completely. But when she spoke again, it had hardened, and there was a determined glint in her eyes. Now all the boys I got is my baby boys, your papa and your Uncle Hammer. And this they place as much as it is mine. They bloods in this land, and here that Harlan Granger always talking about buying it. He pestered Paul Edward to death about buying it, now he pestering me. She grumped angrily. He don't know nothing about me or this land. He think I'm gonna sell. She became silent again. A cold wind rose biting through my jacket, and I shivered. Big Ma looked down at me for the first time. You cold? No, ma'am, I stuttered, not ready to leave the forest. Don't you be lying to me, girl, she snapped, putting out her hand. It's time we was going back to the house anyway. Your mom will be home soon. I took her hand, and together we left the Caroline. Right, make sure you're answering the questions on your form. Go back and look at these pages if you need help. Come to office hours if you have a question.